I know Mr. Grassi is here. When he stops working the crowd. Hey, Rich?
So for the record.
All set, Heather?
Oh, okay. I'll switch with you.
I'll meet you.
Let's just do it.
Mr. Grassi?
He's running for office.
Exactly. Now the weather is starting to get a little warmer and all that.
Today got nice.
So we're going to call the meeting to order at 6:30. First call is the roll call of members. We have a new victim that's going to be doing the minutes for this meeting. And it may be a little difficult for him, so that if we don't mind, Joe, starting with yourself, to just say your name, and we'll have it on the video so he can watch the video.
Joe Coughlin, Town of Plymouth, appointee.
Pine Dubois, Speaker of the House, appointee.
Rich Grassi, Minority House member, I don't know what he is.
That's good enough.
Bob Hayden, Massachusetts DPU.
Robert Jones, Health and Human Services, on behalf of Secretary Mary Lou Sutters.
Dave Johnston, Mass DP, on behalf of Matt Beaton, Energy and Environmental Affairs.
Kurt Schwartz, Massachusetts Emergency Management Agency.
Sean Mullen, Plymouth.
Heather Leitner, Town of Plymouth, appointee.
John Mahoney, Plymouth Board of Selectmen.
Dave Nichols, appointed by Governor Baker.
John Orenberg, Entergy. Kevin O'Reilly from Plymouth, appointed by the Speaker.
Paul Smith, Utility Workers Union of America, representing the men and women who work at Pilgrim Station.
Joe Lynch, Government Affairs Manager for Entergy for Mike Toomey.
Dan Wolf from Cape Cod, appointment of the Senate President.
So we clearly have a quorum. Thank you all for coming. Just one reminder for all of us, the microphones, as always, will be fully on. So unless you want it to be recorded and played. I'll also like to note that Pat Chiramella has just arrived as well. So the only ones of our membership not in attendance, I see, are Jessica Casey, John Chapman, let's see, Jack Priest, and John Flores. Everyone else is present, so we have 17 members present. The first thing I'd like to do, you may recall at the last meeting, we agreed to roll over to this meeting the approval of the minutes from our February 21st meeting. Pine had a number of comments, and it's going to be particularly difficult without having Alan here. But I think, Pine, if you don't mind just going through briefly what you would like to amend and correct, and then we can take a vote on it.
Okay, I had a couple of problems with the way the report from Entergy was characterized in the minutes. So these suggestions and questions relate to page 3, lines 6 through 30. So I'd like some clarification on the minutes as reported. I wrote this up, and I can just give it to for the minutes of next time. In particular, with reference to the jetty, line 8, the quote is that at 11.2 above mean sea level, Pine notes that 11.2 is the highest point on the jetty, which is not level, and mean sea level is reference to a date more than 50 years ago. Entergy should clarify in writing and provide a clear site elevation and mapping with reference to the datums, but I don't think that it's clear, and I've had this conversation with Joe, so at least he knows what I'm talking about. So we need some clarification on that. The IFCC pad elevation and location of the IFCC to the shore is roughly 200 feet, as noted on line 10 on page 3, and that's a mean low water mark. So it depends on how high the water is as to how the distance from the pad. So since my concern is relative to the flooding, it would be nice if we had that dimension as well, because it's when the water is high that there's a problem, not when it's low. Line 28 through 21, the quote is, asked whether the 13.5 feet below mean sea level was inside the intake or canal or outside. And I think that what the notes say is that it's outside, but that it's not clear what that means, whether it's the structure or the canal, because the canal is very large part of the site. And so it would be great if we had even a diagram that we could slap in the minutes where it would tell you, this is where the measurement of our tides are on site. Lines 27 through 30, we mentioned different buoys could be used to measure the sea around Pilgrim. What the notes say is that there are buoys out there in the bay and there are not. So I just want those clarifications in the minutes, and I don't know what the easiest way to do that is.
Let me just make an open suggestion, and then we can discuss it. It sounds like a few of the topics might be additions to what was actually said, and that isn't necessarily the minutes. So what I'd like to say is, and I don't know how long Alan's going to be out of pocket for, but I'd like to give it to him, and let him go over it, because anything, the minutes can only reflect what was actually said.
No, I'm actually pointing to issues where I think that it was misinterpreted.
Okay, the good news.
In the minutes.
The good news is we have video, and we will go through it. So if the panel doesn't mind, I think we should just defer it until Alan goes through and tells us, this is actually what was said, and is that okay by you, Pine?
That's fine with me.
How's the panel feel about it? No motion needed, we just all agree. Okay.
But I want to clarify, I heard you say it would be nice if there was a
Yeah.
diagram. We can't put diagrams in unless the diagram was presented at the meeting. So,
Oh, he showed us slides.
I mean,
He showed us slides, he just didn't have it where it was. So,
Okay.
and I asked him for clarification at the meeting. Remember, we had that discussion. Is it the trash racks? Is it inside the
Yeah,
trash racks?
yeah.
And I think the interpretation of the note taker was that it was outside, and I don't believe that's what was
Yeah,
said. So
and-
that's really why I'm bringing it
And,
up.
and that's important, and what we can do is we can go right back to the video, make sure that any document that was submitted could be included in the minutes, and also to get it right. Thank you. Let me just quickly go through what the purpose of tonight's meeting, as we've been discussing literally for the last 4 or 5 months. This has been an iterative learning process, the education part, as we discussed both at February and then subsequently at our earlier meeting. The purpose of tonight's meeting is to start getting down to the discussions of what the panel has learned and heard and what the findings are, as well as from the working groups and the progress they've made, and we've got some excellent work there, as well as from the public. That's the purpose of the meeting. And as the agenda reflected, there's going to be votes tonight. We're going to take votes on things, and I know Kurt would like to make a comment on that. Let me just quickly lay out what I'm suggesting and recommending the process will be. This is, in my suggestion, the first of 3 bites at the apple. That after tonight's votes, we'll redistribute information. Please keep in mind, we cannot deliberate back and forth in emails. The emails are for distribution purposes only. We cannot violate the open meeting law by conversing back and forth about what we see. It's for the purposes of compiling it and getting it ready for these meetings, so that's the important thing. The second part of this is, I've laid out the framework. I will be sharing it with you early to mid next week of what the document might look like. Again, it's a framework and a draft that hopefully at our May meeting will help us say, geez, that doesn't look bad, or what if we added this, that kind of thing. For example, today there are no appendices or attachments in the current format, but there's all of the other stuff. There's attributes, who did we listen to as a panel? Same will be done for each of the working groups. The working group section reflects exactly the same as the panel-wide. So I think once you see it, again, we should use it for the May meeting to say, let's tweak this a little and work on it. So that's one. The second part of it is the schedule. We've got the May meeting coming up, which I hope everyone can attend, and then we have a June meeting. My goal, again, is by Wednesday next week, give or take, to get you out the overall template. I think you've already gotten the basic template for the working groups. Some of the information I'm just going to pick on the PSD, AR, and decommissioning work group. This is an excellent piece of work because the ability to take the same format that we're currently using, it'll eliminate it, and once we go through what we wanted to say, that will be it. Well, so that will be done and distributed by the end of next week, the format and these first ones. After that, we'll have a second bite at the apple on the May meeting. And by the bite at the apple, I mean another round of discussion on what topics we don't vote on this evening, more discussion, more input from both the public and from the working groups. I know Dave's been diligently working, and we'll have a full formal one for next one, but you're making great progress on it. So that's the kind of thing. Again, the cycle will repeat itself after the May meeting. This time, it will be in the draft format that we agree to next time. That draft format, when we'll go out to everybody with what we've done so far and what needs to go in it. The goal being, as we've always stated, that by our June 20th meeting, we'll have had 3 bites at the apple, 3 chances to edit, discuss, and vote on things, and we will then go ahead and try to get a final report done. So that's my plan. Any comments on the plan? Maybe this would be a good time for you to raise your concerns.
Well, the concern I've raised privately with Sean is it seems that we're moving to voting on recommendations quickly and perhaps too quickly. And my thought is that, you know, we formed working groups to tackle all of, or if not all, most of the substantive areas that we thought this panel should be focused on, at least initially. And it's my thought that we should now look to the working groups to be formulating recommendations to the extent they're ready to formulate recommendations, and to make sure that we're giving the working groups enough time to build the expertise and knowledge to propose recommendations. I think some of what we may be looking at in terms of draft recommendations are not coming to us tonight from working groups. But even beyond that, as recommendations are coming to us, because we've had no opportunity to discuss, you know, my suggestion is that if there are recommendations this group thinks should be made at this point in our process, let's have a discussion. Let's narrow down on which ones the group. Let's discuss them tonight, pros and cons. Let's have public comment on them, and then we come back at our next meeting in a better position to vote on them. And then my last point is that, and I raised this last meeting, I don't feel compelled, I don't feel that the panel should be feeling compelled to include a broad range of recommendations in a report this June. I think what we ought to do is be, in the world of things we have to grapple with and look at, let's figure out what it is that's time sensitive now. If there are some things that we need to be speaking about now, let's just focus on those. So I'm just concerned we're moving too quickly, but I think I'll reserve more comment till I see what recommendations are actually coming before us and how people feel on them. So.
Are there any comments from any members of the panel? Paul?
A question to the chair. So the format then, as I understand it, would be, we would start with simple finding like number 1 and then read the recommendation. Would you entertain amendments to the recommendation, or you want to vote?
No, that's the idea, is to discuss it. This is when the rubber hits the road. This is when we start coming up, and we've got to, and to that point, for this evening's meeting, if there are votes, and I hope there will be votes, it's going to be taken by name, because this is not a secret ballot. This is 11 votes to pass anything, regardless of whether or not we have 11 people here or 12. We have more than a quorum, so that everybody will be on the record how they vote on each of the votes. So, yes, the idea is to discuss it. If someone doesn't make a motion to move the vote, it won't happen. And it can be reserved for the next bite at the apple. Any other comments on, yes, Joe?
Thank you, Chairman. I believe that Mike Toomey provided an email back to you after receiving the recommendations that we would need additional time to review, understand, and provide comments back on the recommendations. And he had requested, based on his private schedule of not being able to be here, that we would discuss it sometime in the future. I'm not sure he received any feedback on that, but obviously, all of these recommendations has an impact on us. We also take them very seriously. So in order for us to evaluate them, provide constructive feedback, I think I'm agreeing with Co-Chair Schwartz that it's happening a little too quick for us to be able to get the right people sitting down, reviewing these, and then providing, kind and mindful feedback to the entire panel for their consideration. So
Okay.
I just wanted to make sure that was
Any other comment?
communicated to the rest of the panel.
Pine?
Yeah, I don't disagree that it's a difficult process and hard for us to do this, having been to a couple of work group meetings in the last 2 days and losing my temper routinely. On the other hand, I don't think we have a lot of time, and I feel as though what we're set up to do is to help assure that the community and the facility are put to bed quickly and safely and responsibly, and that's upon us in a year's time. And we know that Entergy has a lot of paperwork to do. We know that we have a lot to learn. I don't think that approving some recommendations here now forecloses adding recommendations later or learning more or coming up to speed. I mean, I'm not a happy learner, I'll admit to that, but it's important that we all learn and understand and keep pace with what's going on. And I think, Mother Nature's way out in front of us. So I disagree with the chair that we should postpone everything. We had a long meeting last night. We're working hard to engage the citizens that don't have the position on the panel that we do. And I would ask the panel to go ahead and vote on those things that we can vote on.
Okay. Joe's and then Rich.
At the last meeting, I raised similar concerns that Kurt had just echoed. However, since the last meeting, our work group has met and done a lot of prep work, and the handout that's in front of you with the recommendations that we came up with, as far as our work group is concerned, we've met the initial challenge to provide recommendations to be discussed, and then if there are changes to be made, great. But it's a template to start. I don't know where the other work groups are, but as far as the PSDAR one is, we're done with phase one, and welcome the discussion and any suggestions to amend, change, whatever you want to do, so we can move on to that next stage. So as a result of that, at least our work group feels much more confident tonight than I felt at the last meeting, that we can meet our schedule, get everything done on time, and provide adequate time for appropriate feedback, review, so forth and so on for all panel members.
Thank you, Joe. Rich, did you have a comment?
Just a couple quick ones. One, it's May 2018. The plant's going to close in June 2019. I think we had some catch-up to do to begin with. I fully agree with Pine that we should be able to focus on the findings and recommendations and vote on them. I can speak for the Safety and Security Working Group that we have a mission statement completed. Our next step is to agree with that mission statement and also to come up with the findings and recommendations that we would submit to you and Kurt to become part of the agenda. So, no, I think we're ready.
Okay. Any other comments? Kevin?
I would just echo with my colleagues on the other side of the room. I said, we do have a mandate. Time is moving quickly. I think we should dive in. The ones that we can deal with, we deal with. The ones that we don't think we can deal with, we'll push off to another meeting. But I think we need to start moving forward.
Senator?
I'd just say that, I mean, if we were talking about substantive reports that get into the granular details of the shutdown and of the management of the plant, I might say we need more information before, but really what we're talking about is embracing a process here and establishing a capacity at a state level so that we have more ability to understand and come up with more comprehensive findings. So I think to the degree that what we're really talking about, I think most of your recommendations are really about helping us to establish a process and then procuring resources to use that process. I think we need to get moving with that because we're not making definitive conclusions here.
Yep.
What we're doing, I think what we've said so far is, oh my God, this is huge lifting. We need the resources of the Commonwealth to help us in addition to what we have here. So I think there's no downside to starting to move forward with that. It would be nice to have some additional input maybe from the executive branch just to make sure we're synced up as we do this. And my concern is what we don't want to do is alienate or stick a finger in the eye of that which we're making a request from.
Yep.
But that having been said, I think we need to refine the process and improve the process so that the outcomes are actually better outcomes.
Thank you. Selectman?
Yeah, Sean, I know we're under this time constraint and we've got 3 months to go, or 3 meetings to go, but I mean, if we never see each other again after June, I'd be shocked. I was always operating under the assumption that, you know, anything that we suggest or try to do is going to come down to the political will of the Golden Dome, of Beacon Hill, so ultimately. But I would be shocked if we didn't meet again after June 20th because there's going to be some sort of, you know, we all know that government likes to kick the can down the road, and I wouldn't be surprised if there's kind of some sort of split the baby. And I understand that there's certain things that we can vote on, there's certain things that we can't. But just to reinforce, if we didn't meet again after June, I'd be shocked.
Thank you. The only comment that I'd like to make before giving my opinion on it is to you, Joe. We built in, and I did reply, but not in as much detail as I wished I could have, to Mike Toomey's correspondence. That absolutely, that was what I said to him, was absolutely. There will be at least 2 more formal public bites at that apple, and that the way I'm recommending we approach this is right down until the final approval, which, you know, might be in July for all we know, that these things are subject to discussion and edit. That's the idea, because we want to get everybody on the same page. We want to, not everybody's going to agree, but I think we've built in well over 3 months. My particular version, draft, has been out there, it'll be out there for over 10 weeks. Plenty of time to talk about it, and one of the other things that, to that point, I'm looking for a volunteer, and it's got to be one of us, I think, because it wouldn't be fair to our new scribe, to, if we do take votes this evening, to write down by the vote who voted for what, because we're going to do it by person, so we have it. Do I have a volunteer, or are we going to have to pick someone? Kevin will do it. Attaboy, Kevin. Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Okay, I couldn't disagree more strongly with Kurt's suggested approach. You know, he and I have briefly discussed it last meeting. I believe it's time to get moving. These are not cut in stone tonight, subject to additional clarification and issue. Whether the final report, did you have a question, Pat, or comment? I'm sorry.
I just wanted to say the time is right. It's timely. As Senator Wolf said, you know, it's the time where the budget, the state is going through the budget process.
Yeah.
So there's an opportunity to get some funding for, as we mentioned earlier, we have all this mandate, but we don't have really anybody to do all the real work behind it. So I think it's timely. I think we gotta move forward. We can always add additional recommendations later.
And there is no, that I read in the statute, and I'm not the attorney, I'll defer, doesn't say anything that I saw that says we can't make recommendations throughout the course of a year if we wanted to vote on it. But there is a requirement, there's an annual report 1 year, and that we're gonna meet that requirement. And if it's 9 pages, or it's 11, or it's 15, it's gonna be just what it is what it is. Okay. So, with that, let's go to the first topic, which was number 4 on your agenda, the review, discussion, and possible vote on the proposed legislation by the legislative delegation that was kind enough to come before us. We were very lucky at our meeting down the Cape earlier the month to have representatives from the entire federal delegation, Senator Warren, Senator Markey, and Congressman Keating, come and present and offer opinion. But I felt particularly happy that the entire legislative delegation, completely bipartisan, came in with one unified voice and submitted it to us. So the question that I'd like to throw out for discussion, and then if anybody wants to make a motion, is do we want to discuss the legislation that was proposed and has been filed? I was told that it did not make it into the House version. I'm also told that it will be or it's already been filed on the Senate side. It was late, it was, but it's the first legislative year, so that's not going to change it. The commitment is still there by the entire delegation. They're not discouraged. I talked to them today about this. So do we want to go on record formally? I'm sorry, let me start with Dave and then I'll do you, Rich.
Yeah, so Mr. Chairman, the Government Affairs Work Group did meet and reviewed the letter from the delegation. I think, although we didn't have a quorum, we reached some consensus that we should respond to the legislative delegation. And we had some minor recommendations and changes that I'd be happy to go through as part of this comment process,
Yeah.
maybe after you get other feedback. But
Okay.
it was the consensus of the people that met at the Government Affairs Work Group that we do respond.
Okay.
And that we do it in a timely manner to give the legislature as much flexibility as possible to try and move this through the process this year.
Excellent. Rich?
I'm just a little confused. We have some legislation that, by the 3 individuals that were at our last meeting. We also, as my understanding, there are 3 pieces of legislation that are still before the House that relate to the Plymouth Nuclear Power Plant.
Yep.
And certain monies or whatever. And it was also my understanding that if those continue to lay where they are in committee or whatever, and you'll know the answer to this, that eventually they'll reach a date, I heard May 9th.
Yeah, the Joint Rule 10 day.
Yeah, where they will no longer exist. Is that correct?
Well, no, they have to be acted on by then.
They have to be acted on.
Right.
See, I'm a little confused.
Yeah.
We've got this legislation over here, we've got this proposed now, and,
I guess the question from.
Excuse me, I'm
Go
sorry.
ahead.
Part of acting on them can be to send them the study, and that basically kills them. So yeah, I mean, there is a date by which there has to be action on it.
Does anybody want to make a motion that the panel's thoughts on their proposed legislation, or do we want to pass on that for the moment? Any sense of what people would like to do? To let them know what we're thinking?
I would like to propose we take a vote on it, because I think,
Yeah.
okay, they're dead bills. If you vote for a dead bill, I mean, it kind of goes to the credibility of the committee, is how I see it.
But, so, Mr. Chairman, I mean, my knowledge, and I defer to the senator too, I mean, the legislature can introduce legislation at any time between now and the end of the session, which will be sometime in June. So, yeah, while there are bills that could potentially be acted on in May 9th, it doesn't preclude the legislature from also moving forward with the recommendations that they unified kind of in the letter here.
Yep.
So we wouldn't be taking action on something that's a dead bill.
And it's not, it's
I
still-
think the legislative delegation is looking for some guidance
Yep.
from this panel on how to move forward. And I believe, I'm happy to make a motion that, throw it out for discussion, that we find some way to communicate our support to
Okay.
the legislative delegation.
So there's a motion
I'll
on the
second
floor.
that.
Second to, so Kevy, this is the first one.
can-
Yeah, oh, yeah, there's
Just
certainly going to be,
clarification.
there's going to be discussion on the motion.
My clarification, all I heard was there's a motion to express support, but I didn't hear for what. And the reason I say for what, are we talking about the letter that was provided to us, or 3 pieces of pending legislation if So if we're, and if we're talking about the letter, the letter did not offer a piece of legislation.
Yeah.
In fact, a piece of legislation was offered, which has not come before this group, the full panel to see. So I just want to make sure you're clarifying what it is we're supporting.
Yeah, it's a good point.
And-
Like, I mean,
and
I
to
think
whom?
we need to communicate support. There was 4 or 5 recommendations in here, and I think that at least the Government Affairs Work Group had some modifications to that. So at least if the panel thinks we ought to communicate something, then we can talk about what, maybe as a second motion, I guess was the order that I was thinking we would do this, but
That, I mean, just to make sure we,
maybe I've made
Right.
it more confusing.
Just,
no,
just
no.
to clarify,
Yeah.
I think what I heard was a motion to express support for
This
the letter
specifically. And that's
which was
exactly-
received
Yeah.
from
What
the
I
legislative delegation.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yes.
yeah.
Okay.
So,
Any other questions, comments on the motion?
Yeah.
I think let me just try to paraphrase it, and then, Selectman, that what the motion is expressing, just to make sure we all understand, is that the panel will take a vote on whether it wants to communicate with the legislative delegation that signed it, that we're in support of it, subject to modifications and edit committees and all that.
Yeah, I think that we've made some helpful changes
Yeah.
that will benefit the
Yeah.
legislature in knowing, and so
Okay.
at some point we can talk about.
Is everybody clear on what the motion is?
Could you repeat the motion, please? So I make sure I get it
Yeah.
right.
The,
You put me in charge of this, so I want to make sure we get it right now.
I don't know if you voluntold for this, or.
I was voluntold.
To rephrase it, David's motion was, should the panel express support and communicate that to support, subject to modification to the legislative delegation?
Got it.
Sure. This is discussion on the motion.
Okay, so you would be asking the panel to vote to support this multi-paged instrument with multiple bills in it with varying kinds of provisions for funding from various sources, the legality of which we haven't discussed or understood, perhaps yourself does, but, so it's not an insignificant vote.
No? But, yeah, I mean, you could rephrase it if you wanted, David, to say that we generally support the intent.
And would like to work with the legislature to move
That's
it
okay.
into legislation.
Is that your revised motion?
Sure, I'm happy to revise it. I think that might be
Okay.
cleaner for the
Okay.
panel.
Say it again, Dave. Hold on one second,
We-
Selectman.
We would like to, I would make a motion that the panel communicate its support in general for the concepts in the letter,
Yeah.
and that we would like to work with the legislative delegation to turn it into a legislative vehicle.
Perfect. That's fine. Let me, the Selectman first, and then we'll get to you guys.
so a motion that asks us to support this generically or in a general sense, subject to modification, is the timeline June 20th to submit our modifications?
No. This is specifically, Selectman, at least as far as I understand it, specifically with the letter that they provided us.
Yes.
With the proposed, that's all this speaks to, is that we will communicate to them our general support, or not. If we vote against it, we won't. If the panel votes in favor of it, we'll communicate to them, thank you for the input. The panel has voted to generally support, subject to additional modifications and working with the legislature, the concepts that you put in.
Okay,
you
so
like
that
me to-
last part there.
Yeah.
So when's that happening? And how do we go through? When would that happen? Working with the legislature for the
I
modifications?
think it would come back from them myself. I mean, wait to hear back from them.
But what if they don't come back to us?
Then we don't probably do anything unless we vote to do something else. Kevin, would you like to read it?
I will try.
Okay.
Motion to express support for the concepts in the letter received from the legislative delegation dated April 11th, and to work with the legislature on modifications to their letter.
That's the revised motion.
I mean, they're gonna have to draft a bill.
Yeah.
And then you're gonna get to see that bill, and you can react to it either as a group or as individuals, or
Joseph?
I guess I'm trying to figure out what the form of how we would communicate to the group of legislators. Is it a letter from us signed by those who support it, not signed by those who don't support it? So what is the mechanism to communicate it?
Since it will be our first, let me just make a recommendation that can be bandied about. I think it would come out under Kurt and I's signature based on the vote of the board, of the panel. and it would say what the motion said. At our meeting on April 26th, the NDCAP motion was made. We just want to let you know.
So it just simply be a majority of the panel?
No, it's 11, so you remember how the vote, because maybe the senator could explain again, but the quorum for the panel is 11. The total number of members of the panel are 21, but for every vote, it's not, if there are 14 people here, you don't need 8, you need 11. So each vote has got to be a majority of the panel.
That's the point I was making.
Yeah, I just want to clarify.
I'm referring back to the way things were done at another NDCAP panel, you can guess the state, where in that particular case, they actually wrote down how many votes were in favor, how many were opposed, how
Yeah.
many abstained. I'm just trying to get.
We're
an
going to do that by
understanding
name.
of the formality, of how this information gets passed on to the sponsors of this.
Yes. I would say.
I think that's important, how
I
we
think it
communicate
is.
it.
It's the first time, so my recommendation would be a letter comes out, signed by the co-chairs, giving them a vote and what the topic was. Senator?
Not to confuse the issue, although I'm probably pretty good at that. There's reference to several different pieces of legislation.
Yeah.
And it could be the case that somebody supports one or more of them, but not all of them.
Right.
So are we gonna take a separate vote on each of the proposed pieces of legislation, or we're gonna vote for the whole bundle?
I think the way Kevin read it is we're supportive of the concept.
Yes, the motion is to express support for the concepts in the letter received from the delegation.
1 second.
I think we'd vote for them in block.
Yeah.
I agree. Well,
Right.
I would submit, Mr. Chairman, even make a motion that if we're going to take the NDCAP findings and recommendations and vote on each one individually, recommendation,
We are.
that there is first of all, a crossover between the two documents, the letter
Yep.
that the legislative group sent to us and so, I mean, somehow, I don't think we can make a vote on just accepting this
If,
carte blanche.
again, if
I
Kevin,
think that each individual recommendation has to be looked at.
yep,
I think, just to clarify, sir, the only thing we're voting on right now is the letter received. We're not voting on
any of
any
the
other
other.
recommendations this time,
understand
right, okay.
Mr. Selectman?
Question for Dan Wolf. Dan, so if this motion were to pass, and we communicate to them that in a general sense, we're in support of this letter, isn't it possible that these legislators could craft one or multiple bills and never reach back out to this committee to see where we are on various aspects of the letter as a whole?
It's possible, but unlikely. Let's put it
Okay.
that way. And I think, actually, we could proactively reach back out to them at any point through the process. I think the concern I have is, are we talking about one bill or multiple bills? Because there is actually a difference relative to how this all plays out.
Right, there's some of the things in here I support and some things I don't, so. I don't want to,
So-
That's the point I'm making.
I don't want to fall for the bait and
Let's-
switch.
Let's do this. We're 10 minutes behind our schedule, so I'm going to close the discussion on it now. Kevin, if one last time you could read the final version of the proposed motion?
Motion made by David Nichols, seconded by Pat Chiramella, to express support for the concepts in the letter received from the legislative delegation dated April 11th, and to commit to work with the legislature on modifications.
Everybody understand? Okay, let's start the vote.
From this end of the table?
No, it's going to go alphabetically. Kevin, if you
I'll
can.
read them. Pat Chiramella,
Yes.
Joe Coughlin,
Yes.
Pine Dubois,
Yes.
John Flores is not here, Richard Grassi,
Yes.
Point of order, okay, that's.
After the vote's done. Next.
Robert Hayden,
Like to abstain.
abstains, David Johnson,
I'm going to abstain.
abstain, Robert Jones,
Abstain?
Heather Leitner,
Yes.
Joseph Lynch,
No.
John Mahoney,
No.
Sean Mullen,
Yes.
David Nichols,
Yes.
John Orenberger,
No.
Kevin O'Reilly, yes. Kurt Schwartz,
Abstain?
Paul Smith,
No? Am I allowed to say anything at all?
we have
Just
one more
no.
vote to
Get the
go,
vote
Paul.
done, and then we'll let you say whatever you want to, Paul.
No.
Dan Wolf.
Yes.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, yes. 1, 2, 3, 4 abstain. And 1, 2, 3, 4 no.
So the motion does not carry. It is not approved. Paul, please.
As a result of the vote and the way I voted, I withdraw my comment.
Okay. Hearing nothing else, we'll go on to the first of the draft findings to begin the discussion.
Mr. Chairman, isn't it distinctly possible that somebody right now could make a motion to support a single one of these, 1 through 5?
Yes, you could.
You could entertain a motion
Good.
to that.
Absolutely could. If is anybody's interested in doing such a thing, I am only going to caution you all, I can stay here all evening. I slept well last evening. So if you would like, I would entertain a motion now to extend our 8:30 deadline to 9 o'clock.
Second.
All in favor, say aye. Aye. All opposed?
Opposed?
1.
Point of information,
Yes.
is it a requirement of the state agencies that they abstain on votes involving state agencies and legislation?
I certainly hope not, since they're voting members of the panel. And if,
That's why I ask, because if it's a requirement, and since all of the state agencies abstained,
you-
it
That's-
seems
that's-
like it should not upset the balance, if you will, of the vote-taking.
I think
And
that's-
I would suggest that we seek clarification on that, because it's pretty dramatic to me that each and all of my friends on the state.
perhaps the folks from the states can tell you why they abstained.
There is no legislative requirement that we abstain. That's
I
all
didn't
it.
ask that, I kind of wondered
So-
if it was a, a policy within state agencies and staff that it it had to do with the safety of their job security, that they do not take positions on things like this.
Any other state member would like to answer Pine's inquiry?
I will answer on behalf of the state agencies that on certain votes tonight, it's not a matter of policy, anything broader than that. On votes of this type tonight, it is likely that the state employee representatives here will abstain.
Any other? Yes,
I have
Joe.
a question. The vote on supporting the concept of the letter notwithstanding, the bulk of the 5 actions proposed in that letter, I suspect, are going to surface in one form or another in the form of the individual recommendations coming from the work groups. And I would hope that if they do, and/or to the extent that they do, they are given individually proper vetting by the panel, because a lot of them, I think, are very, very important. Certainly important to discuss. However the panel wants to vote is up to the individual members. But just because the supporting the concept of the letter was not approved, I hope that doesn't mean that to the extent that any of these actions that are contained within the letter that surface in our discussions just aren't automatically not supported either.
With that, let's move on, and I am going to,
Mr. Chairman?
yes.
I'll make a motion to support number 3 of the legislative letter with respect to the 10 millirem radiologic cleanup.
Before we do that, Mrs. Selectman, let me just get a sense of the panel. Do we want to get into this individual piece now? In a simple raise of hands, if we want to do it, raise your hand. How many we got? We're gonna have to take a vote.
Is this vote two? Is this official?
This is vote two, Kevin, to determine whether or not we want to consider motions on individual sections of the letter from the legislative delegation. Is there a second on that motion?
Second.
Thank you.
You doing discussion or not?
I don't think, I think we've discussed it before.
So, motion made by Mr. Mahoney?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, you could-
Oh, no,
you
this
were
is
asking
yours, your
just
motion.
for-
Motion by
I got it.
Mr. Mullen.
Yeah.
Seconded by Heather. The motion is to determine whether to consider individual sections on the legislative letter dated April 11th for votes.
Correct.
Okay?
Call a vote.
We're very busy tonight here.
You didn't expect it.
Vote two, Pat Chiramella,
Yes.
Joe Coughlin,
Yes.
Pine Dubois,
Yes.
Rich Grassi, Robert Hayden,
Abstain.
David Johnson,
Abstain.
Robert Jones, Heather Leitner,
Yes.
Joseph Lynch,
Abstain.
John Mahoney,
Yes.
Sean Mullen,
Yes.
David Nichols,
Yes.
John Urenberger,
No.
Kevin O'Reilly, yes. Kurt Schwartz,
Abstain.
Paul Smith,
No.
Dan Wolf.
Yes.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 yeses.
Motion did not carry, so we'll continue. So the answer, Mr. Selectman, is the motion didn't carry to consider the motion.
Thank you.
Next agenda item is to go into the draft findings and recommendations that have been submitted so far. I'd like to start with the ones that were distributed about 2 weeks ago that I drafted on, from my perspective of the things that I felt collectively we may have learned. So I'd like to open it to discussion for draft finding number 1 and recommendation number 1. Any comments, any questions? Yes?
Yes, as, I certainly appreciate the great effort that went into the organization and the skill obviously shown here. But taking from the experience of the state legislators' bills that were created, I don't see, based on the experience at Yankee Row, another nuclear power plant decommissioned to Greenfield and in short order, okay, and returned to the public and to its normal use, using the existing state agencies that we all like and respect. I think, as they did out in the western part of the state, the Department of Environmental Affairs, or Environmental Protection, okay, was more than adequate in its oversight role, okay, and harnessing all those other departments of the state regulators that are in existence, with standards that are in existence. And I would think it would be negative and would not serve the town of Plymouth, okay, or the site, to add another level of bureaucracy.
Any
That's
other
my
comments
opinion.
on it? No other comments on finding? Yes, Joe?
I disagree with that. I believe that because this body, the panel, has virtually no authority, it's an advisory group, and that's fine. But the executive branch, and I'm not talking about authority over decommissioning, I'm just saying authority in general for state government, the executive branch has a lot of authority and a lot of ability. The executive branch, if it wants to, can certainly even get members of the legislature to propose legislation on Beacon Hill to accomplish whatever the executive branch may want to. I believe that the existence of a interagency group, I don't look at it as redundant if it's handled properly, because it's a higher level than just a advisory panel is. I think if it's set up properly and there's adequate liaison between NDCAP and that working group, I think it can enhance our ability to accomplish even more with all of our colleagues. So I think the concept recommended there is a good one, and I would support it.
Any other comments?
Mr.
Senator?
Mullin.
Yeah, I mean, the idea behind this was to be as comprehensive as we could. We did hear from the Vermont experience that it was helpful to have a structure that involved an interagency working group. I think that there are going to be issues that the EOEA is not as prepared to weigh in on, that they may defer to one of the others in the interagency group to actually do some homework. I think the structure is one that allows for a much more comprehensive outcome and gives us, you know, a broader net to throw. I don't know why we wouldn't do that. It is the case that EOEA might reach out to another agency anyway if they had a question about public safety or a question about for the utilities. But I actually think one of the jobs we have here on behalf of the citizens of the Commonwealth is to make this as comprehensive as we can. And therefore, I think the interagency working group should, by mandate, include all of these groups.
Thank you. Kevin?
I'll go back to my notes from our January meeting where folks from Vermont came down. And the one I had a star next to was that having interagency cooperation is essential to the process. What else do we need to know from the folks that have already been through this?
Paul?
To that end, I find that the arguments presented by the good Senator Wolf and Mr. Kevin O'Reilly, Chamber of Commerce, support my premise that we have these organizations already in place. They already work together. They've proven that they can work together, as they did at Yankee Row. We have decommissioned over 100 power plants, okay, across the U.S., and many of them very local to New England. I don't know what the addition of another organization would do to help that.
Any other
Thank you.
comments? Fine.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The problem is that although we have a government, we don't have an organization that will help us address the concerns that the public has, and that even, you know, people that are interested in reuse have on this site in terms of cleaning it up. It's new territory. It bears a lot of risk. It has a lot of potential catastrophes associated with it. Without a mandate for the state to actually approach this in a unified way, there isn't the capacity in the state to do that. Even though, yes, we have a lot of state agencies, they don't necessarily all focus on the same thing at the same time. And so what we're looking to do is create the capacity for them to be able to do that would actually expedite the process of decommissioning, so that we can be more efficient, more effective, more knowledgeable, and get a job done that we all want to do. Approaching it this way is not going to happen.
Any other comments? Joe?
Thank you. Just a follow-on to Senator Wolf's comments about Vermont. Vermont does not have this in place right now. Vermont has a meeting amongst all agencies on a monthly basis. It doesn't have any feedback mechanism for providing recommendations to either the legislature, the government, or Entergy. So I just want to make sure that people understand that this is not modeled after what happens in Vermont. Vermont, it's simply a monthly meeting where all agencies get together to ensure they're all sharing information about the decommissioning of Vermont Yankee, but there's no additional feedback or actions from that meeting. So I'm not sure if what Dr. Irwin's comments were misinterpreted, but I just want to make sure that people understood that this is, maybe the architecture of this is based on Vermont. Maybe we're trying to do something different here, but this is not what is in place in Vermont right now.
David?
Yeah, I just, as I think about how government works and the finding here, I guess I would be more comfortable with us recommending the interagency work group and the designation of an agency that leads and everything that's in here without saying how the governor should do it. There's a lot of different ways for the governor to execute that authority. And we shouldn't, it could be the legislature that creates the interagency work group. I think if this panel comes out and says we need an interagency work group and it should work in some fashion like is laid out here, without saying how that's achieved, it will give us more room to actually achieve that goal. So I guess I would make an amendment to the motion to strike the executive order and just say that the governor creates.
And I'd like to just use this as a point that I think is absolutely critical to our entire deliberations, because we can now deliberate in an open meeting. Our entire deliberations, that this is exactly the kind of discussion that if the group wants to edit one of these, chuck it, start it over, whatever. That's what this is all about. So Senator, your point.
Yeah, I mean, Joe and I are gonna fight over the water, that's all we're gonna fight over. I think we're all making each other's points.
Yeah.
The fact is, if a process is working in Vermont,
Yeah.
it gives us the opportunity to mandate a process here that may not be replicated unless somebody mandates it. So what I'm simply saying is, and I'm not misunderstanding or interpreting what we heard from Vermont. What I'm saying is, the fact that they're doing it doesn't mean it's gonna happen here. This would ensure that it happened here. And that's our very role as this group, is to try to mandate, or at least make strong recommendations based on what we're seeing elsewhere about what we think should happen or needs to happen here to have an effective decommissioning.
Dan, I'd like to make two suggestions to move this forward, because we've got many of these to go through. The first suggestion is there a motion from any member of the panel to approve finding 1 and recommendation 1 as written?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second. Moved by.
We had the discussion on the motion, unless somebody feels strongly we haven't?
So-
I have a point.
Yes, John?
on that.
This particular recommendation has the governor creating a group and then managing the shutdown, pre and post shutdown decommissioning process at buildings.
Which is,
So,
that
so,
wording
so
has
we're,
to change.
so we're going to manage that via the state agency that you're going to create at some given time or other via an executive order by the governor. I think that's a bad thing for Pilgrim and for the state and for the governor to be doing.
Can I follow? I think there's two, to the extent the panel is going to consider the substance here, I think there's two things that should be changed. One is to follow David's comments. I don't think we should be mandating that the governor, trying to mandate the governor issue an executive order. It would be sufficient to say that the NDCAP recommends that, creating an interagency work group within the executive department, something like. So, and second, it's absolutely right. The state is not going to manage the shutdown and the decommissioning. It is that interagency working group would manage the state's work associated with, or something like that, but.
Well, with credit given to our colleague in the public, Jim Lampert, Jim made a good suggestion, which I would like to just run by you. So that the recommendation 1 in Jim's suggestion, which I'd like you to listen to and then consider, the NDCAP recommends the governor issue an executive order creating an interagency work group to monitor and work with the licensee during the pre and post shutdown decommissioning process at Plymouth Nuclear Power Station. So it's slightly different word. Take out the manage, takes out the direct preemptive problem potentially, and it describes working with the licensee, regardless of whether that's Entergy or a later sale if it goes to decon. So I thought the suggestion was well worth bringing up. Yes, Kevin?
Just a point of order. There's a motion
On the first
on the first one. Are you withdrawing that motion?
It was my motion, I would
Oh, I'm
accept
sorry.
that as an amendment.
Okay, so I'll withdraw the first motion.
Well,
Accept it.
actually, you have to withdraw the
Well, I'm
motion.
not, I'm just accepting that as an amendment to my motion, or I'll withdraw it, whichever moves things faster. I'm not
Whatever you
trying to
think will move it faster.
Second the amendment.
Okay.
I'd
All right,
like to
could-
just make a point, with the amount of discussion we've had and the amendment to the motion or the amendment to the recommendation, that Entergy, once again, to Joe Lynch's point, Entergy has not had sufficient time to look at these documents or any of these motions sufficiently to be able to vote with all aspects of it, considered.
Okay.
Similarly, if we had the time, the state might be able to come back at a next meeting and substantively vote on this or others if we had enough time as well, so.
I'm not gonna comment on that because I disagree that folks haven't had this long enough to read it and understand as simple as it is. But that being said, there is a motion on the floor. Kevin?
Are you going to read the amendment, or will you just give it to
I'm
me
gonna
later?
read it now, so everybody hears it one last time. That the motion would be to accept finding one and recommendation one as amended, first sentence of which would now read, the NDCAP recommends the governor issue an executive order creating an interagency work group to monitor and work with the licensee during the pre- and post-shutdown decommissioning process at Plymouth Nuclear Power Station. Everything else would be the same. Is that
So that's where accurate. I'd like to further amend the amendment.
okay?
And suggest that you should strike, create an executive order to give the governor flexibility to do this in any means under his authority.
Yes. I agree. Yes,
So
absolutely.
just read the governor create.
So, let's revise the amendment again.
Okay.
The NDCAP recommends the governor form an interagency working group to monitor and work with the licensee during the pre- and post-shutdown decommissioning process at Plymouth. Then we gotta revise the next sentence, of course, because it again says, as part of the executive order.
So you can just strike that part, right?
Strike the next
Any
sentence.
reference to executive order.
Would everybody be in agree with that?
Can I ask a question?
Please.
Is there a reason we're looking for the governor to do this? I mean, it seems like there's a lot of ways to do things like this
Well, there's
legislatively.
I can just tell you, David, there's certainly been a lot of inbound individuals to me saying they think the Attorney General should.
That's a good point, and I think that supports what I'm saying. I would suggest that you just strike reference to the governor. If you leave reference to creation of the interagency body to work with.
Who does it?
Who's gonna do
I
it?
think the legislature can do it, the governor can do it, one of the agencies could do it. I think the governor could do it, but we're not telling the Commonwealth how to do it.
So you're saying we recommend the
Commonwealth.
Commonwealth form?
Yes.
What's the thoughts of everyone?
Seems
I'm gonna tell you my personal opinion. It's watering down the clarity of what we've learned so far to date. Now, whatever the panel's view is on this, that's fine. But let me just give you one example. If, for example, Entergy would like to enter into an MOU with the Commonwealth, who are they gonna talk to? Who are they gonna call? Who are they gonna sit down with and say, we'd be willing to perhaps talk about it? Who? Who am I talking to? I think what we've learned, and again, let's go through the iterative education process we started 10 months ago. What we've learned and what we've heard is that if you don't have an organization, an individual who's actually working directly with Entergy, it's very difficult during this pre- and post-shutdown of decommissioning. That's at least what I've learned. I don't know whether everybody agrees. I certainly understand your point, David, that, we don't want to be prescriptive to the governor. That's not the goal, I don't think, is to be prescriptive. But what we want to do is be clear that what we're saying, I think, if everybody generally, and we seem to be close to that, we've got to assemble these resources, we've got to devote and dedicate these. Kevin, do you have a?
The governor is the chief executive
Right.
of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. If he doesn't want to do it, he can appoint somebody else to do it. But I think you go to the chief executive of the organization and let that person decide.
I personally agree with that. So, read it as amended. Let's move a vote because I have a.
As amended, the NDCAP recommends the governor form an interagency working group to monitor and work with the licensee during pre- and post-shutdown, and strike any reference to executive order.
Then strike that next sentence.
Mhm.
I
beginning of the next sentence.
Yes, Joe?
I'd like to propose a further amendment. Keep what Kevin just read, and at the end of that first sentence, add in conjunction with the NDCAP.
I like that.
I like it too.
Keeps us all in the loop together, however it's pursued.
It'll be interesting to see. Does anybody like to move the vote?
I'll move to vote.
Okay?
We need a second to his
Second
further
by
amendment.
Second by Pine, I'm sorry. Thank you, Kevin.
You're gonna put me in charge of this, you know.
Robert's Rules of Order.
We went through the experienced man.
I'm just supposed to vote on all these different amendments. We're just putting it all together.
On vote 3, Pat Chiramella,
Yes.
Joe Coughlin,
Yes.
Pine Dubois,
Yes.
Richard Grassi, Robert Hayden,
Abstain?
David Johnson,
Abstain?
Robert Jones,
Abstain.
Heather Leitner,
Yes.
Joseph Lynch,
Abstain.
John Mahoney,
Yes.
Sean Mullen,
Yes.
David Nichols,
Yes.
John Orenberger,
No.
Kevin O'Reilly, yes. Kurt Schwartz,
Abstain.
Paul Smith,
No.
Dan Wolf.
Yes.
10 again.
Am I mistaken, or is there a pattern emerging? So, with that, let me interrupt the flow and ask whether anybody would like to discuss whether it's worthwhile to go through any of the other findings tonight.
Doing some high-level math here. There are 17 people here. Between Entergy and the Commonwealth, which seems either predisposed to vote no or abstain, we're never gonna get to 11. So I would suggest that we table it.
I would agree. With that, will I entertain a motion to move on to the next agenda item of letting the public comment on what they've just witnessed?
Can I make, again, a suggestion?
Yeah.
What you heard from some of us here is that a discussion of some of these would be very valuable. We have 2 documents in front of us. I see, I think, how many? 10 proposed findings in one, and I think you had 6. How many did you have? 6 in another, so I've got 16 sitting in front of us. I think it would be very valuable to discuss these and figure out where we all are, prioritize them, and we might find that we can come back together and have a different outcome if we don't, we all take a step back and say, let's discuss, let's deliberate, and let's see if we can't move to a consensus.
I was gonna say,
I thought that's what we
I was
just
gonna
did.
offer the
And
same
then-
thing in that, I mean, I felt like the time we spent modifying these was very useful.
Absolutely.
And
That's the
I would
idea.
recommend we continue to move through and modify them. You know, unfortunately, we can't exchange emails to modify them, so we either modify them here or we don't modify them. So I think if we advance that, we get them all into a condition that we're all a little more comfortable with, and I think, as Kurt said, I think we'll be more successful next
Well, we
meeting.
certainly, yeah, Heather, I'm sorry.
I just have a comment and a question. I'm just wondering if all of the appointees from the state agencies are going to abstain. Well, I want to know, first of all, if that is going to happen. I know you probably can't answer that all the way. But if they are going to vote, maybe it would be helpful if they took some of what we're talking about tonight back and talk with their colleagues so they could vote at a future meeting.
Any other comments? Yes, Joe.
I'd like to echo what Heather said. All we're looking for is a little more time. And I think debating the merits of each one of these will have some value, but 8 days is not enough time to decide on our future, frankly. So I think we agree with the spirit of how this is all happening. It just happened in too quick of a schedule for us to be able to understand, provide hopefully credible feedback, and then possibly reach consensus.
I have no problem with that. Would you like to defer any votes, for example, on these discussion until the May meeting? Is that enough time?
Yes, I believe that's what we communicated.
Okay,
in our
is there
comments
anyone
back.
here that doesn't think that'll be enough time from the state's perspective? Because clearly the state's concerned that they haven't had enough time. Would May be enough time?
Well,
Mr.
I think
Chairman.
all I can say is we know tonight is not enough time. So, and I'm the one that's first suggested it might be very valuable to discuss and prioritize these. I'd like to personally hear where the other working groups are in terms of being ready to present recommendations as well, so.
Joseph?
If that's the general consensus, then I would offer that what you might want to do is to ask for any and all recommendations that the groups have tonight that haven't been handed in, that they give to the chairs. And when you get through with the public comment, I know there are several people who have recommendations that they want to submit. And for those work groups that are not ready to submit, if they believe they are going to have some recommendations, but they're just not ready yet to provide them, I think you ought to put a date, a deadline for them, have them electronically send them in to the co-chairs, and you get the total number of let's say there's 20 of them, 30 of them, whatever it is in the end, and then that package be put together and sent out to everybody, not for comment, because we can't do that, but so that everybody has the entire package of all the recommendations that have been received by the chairs, whether it's from the public or from the work groups or what have you, so that if that's the direction the panel wants to go, at then the next meeting, we should all come prepared to discuss all of the recommendations that have been received by the co-chairs and distributed to the entire panel.
Couldn't agree more. I mean, we've tried to do that to this point, but apparently for some folks, it hasn't been enough time, and that's understandable. It sounds like, at least from Entergy's perspective, you know, the next meeting in May, 3 weeks, 3.5 weeks away, that'll be enough time. That would be the second bite at the apple. And if we can't make the deadline in the statute, we do the best we can by when we can. But I agree with your process.
To that point, if that's the process that the panel wants to follow with that kind of a timeframe, if when we get to the next meeting in May, if in fact, because maybe this was a good indication of the amount of time it's going to take to go through however many recommendations there are, if there's a general sense at the next meeting that we can only get through X number, which I suspect will be the case, then I think the chairs should entertain the idea of holding another meeting that's not currently scheduled in May to try and finish and hold it exclusively for the discussion of the recommendations, and whether that's 3 hours long or whatever, to get it done, so there's then sufficient time after that to then consolidate whatever the final recommendations look like, consolidate into a draft report, then to get out to everybody, so as to then try to still hopefully meet the late June target of finalizing it and sending it forward as the legislation requires.
Is there any appetite among the panel members to hold a second meeting, perhaps in early June, because we've got, you know, a number of weeks in everybody's schedule? Is there any appetite for that? Selectman?
I think it's a good idea as a backup. You can always set the meeting now, and if you find out that we don't need it, we can just cancel it.
Heather?
I was just going to say I was in agreement with having a second meeting in May.
Can I offer a different way to?
Sure.
I haven't thought about this, but we might get to the same place. Again, I go back to the working group structure we formed, and I was prepared and am prepared to defer to a very great degree to the working groups because we've entrusted each working group to spend the necessary time to build the knowledge, expertise, and make recommendations. So I'll ask the question, is it necessary for the full panel to have to agree and vote on all of the working group recommendations, as opposed to creating an annual report that says we created 6 working groups, and the working groups have each met, and there'll be a section for each working group, and the report would report out the recommendations that each working group has made. And would give voice to the working groups. And those total number of recommendations might be 30. Out of those 30, the full panel might just want to act on and highlight and prioritize just a few of them, but they will be the working group's recommendations, and they would be in a report. So I don't know how we're going to get through 20, 30. I've got 16 right here, and that's only one, and this is only one working group. So
But
I'm just,
along those lines, if the group wanted to pursue that approach, one of the concerns that I have is, I suspect, once the working groups finish and submit whatever recommendations they're going to, there's going to be some overlap and duplication, because in my group, we know that because some of the issues we decided to take up, and that's fine. That actually may lend additional emphasis to a particular recommendation if more than one group is focusing on it and making sort of a similar recommendation.
as long as they don't conflict.
Right, if they conflict, then there's gonna have to be some sort of a discussion by the panel as to which one do they pick, if any. But I just wanted to bring that up, that if the group wants to head in that kind of a direction and to make a section in the report to list the recommendations from the panels, then to the extent there's either conflict, as you say, or there's overlap, that will simply be evident. And then how then does the panel want to deal with that? Because we don't want to just confuse the public and the executive branch and the legislative branch and the general court and so forth and so on. Don't want them to read it and say, well, now, wait a minute. It looks like there's a lot of conflict in here. What the hell's the panel been doing? You know, they should have solved it instead of wasting our time sending us something they couldn't agree on. So I simply raise that as something I think that needs to be considered along with that suggestion.
I mean, this may work, Kurt, because the framework that I'll be distributing the draft idea next week, it includes the same format for each of the working groups. The question that I will have, and we'll have to think this through, and this is a good discussion, is to say, okay, wait a minute. If for example, as you clarified regarding the minutes of working group meetings, and regarding whether the working group could actually adopt things without having the minutes available, if the full panel, we'll have to make sure we explain that the full panel is only doing these 3, 5, whatever recommendations. But from an informational purpose only, these are what the working groups have recommended. Is that what you're saying?
To me, that may work, because there's no way I don't think we should be taking up 30 recommendations as a full panel. Let's let the working groups do what they were charged with doing, and I'll just use the PSDAR as an example. You know, there's a number of recommendations here. I personally might disagree. I'm not saying I do. I might personally disagree, but that's okay. This is the work of the working group. The full panel may want to just, of all of the 30, may want to focus down on just a few things that are high-level priorities. You know, for example, the one we've been discussing about an interagency working group may not come out of any of the working groups. That may be something that the full panel wants to focus on. I'm just trying to find a way to deal with.
I think we
So
all
we're
are.
not here all of June.
That's was my
But
understanding
the senator
when we started.
disagrees.
I'm sorry.
Look, I run a business in an extremely complicated industry, and it's a very technical industry. We're talking about the operating and decommissioning of a nuclear power plant, which is a very complex scientific issue. How do I, as a member of this panel, have any faith and credibility in the work of a working group I'm not on, that they are garnering the resources and understand the issues well enough so that something that they recommend is something that is going to represent what I would ultimately recommend? My focus here has been on process, and Kurt, you were the one a number of meetings ago.
It's a process.
Yes, and who actually, talked about putting together an interagency group. All I wanted to do was codify that, because I thought it was such a good idea. I'm really concerned that the process, I think process determines outcome. That's just how I'm wired. I don't understand how this process works, guys. I've made it to 1 or 2 working group meetings. I'm not an expert. For me to actually become enough of an expert to render findings and outcomes that are going to be germane to what we're here to do, especially since Entergy has in their employ all the experts, I don't understand this. I don't understand the process. So I'm sorry to hit the reset button, but I just don't get it.
Well,
I thought the entire reason we were putting together an interagency working group and giving them resources so that they had the capacity to bring in people who actually could come up with findings that would have credibility behind them. If anybody from the outside looks at one of these working groups and points to 4 or 5 people around this table and says, tell me exactly how you're credible to have come up with these findings, what am I going to say? Mary Lambert told me? Honestly, it's this. That's an idea. Yeah, well, that actually would be the most credible I could come up with, because otherwise, what are we relying on?
Well, the only thing I can say, Senator, is that in my particular drafts, I've tried to keep it at a high-level process.
Yeah.
point. And I think that's where we'll ultimately get down to. So I'd like to go back to the first one with your concerns in mind and just throw out a date. May 30th, Wednesday, May 30th. I don't know what facility is going to be available. You can all take some pleasure in the fact that you're not the ones having to coordinate getting facilities, but we're currently scheduled to meet on May 16th. That's our next scheduled meeting. Do you want to do May 30th? Do you want to go into June? What would be the pleasure of the panel?
What is the purpose of the meeting?
As I understand it, the purpose would be, as sort of a consensus discussion, that we want to take these findings and recommendations, have a chance to really discuss them after our state colleagues and friends and Entergy have had a chance to read them, so that they're comfortable, that they know how they want to respond, and come back and now finally to get some votes on specific language for the findings and recommendations that we will include in the report. And there would seem to be a sense that it's gonna take more time together, since we can't do it in any other way within compliance with the open meeting law, that's the only way to do it. Yes.
Would it be better to have the 16th meeting to be another discussion round and then
Oh,
vote
yeah,
the
absolutely.
following?
Yeah, absolutely.
How do the working groups factor into what we're considering? What we have before us are your personal, says Sean Mullins, findings and recommendations.
No, what it says is draft.
Well, draft,
For
but.
discussion.
Right, so.
The idea is, and I think the way the working groups factor into it, Kurt, is that they will present, as we talked with David earlier tonight, the PSDAR, they go through theirs and they tell us, here's what we've come up with, we talk about it as a group, we decide whether we want to vote on it.
So how do we, until we have the work of until all of the working groups have weighed in and put their recommendations on the table, how do we know where to start?
Here's one way to start with, here's two.
But in terms of, for me, in terms of saying, okay, here are what I think are the 10 most important, if I've only got 2 working groups in front of me, I'm making, so that's why, one of the things I said up front is, can we figure, can everybody just report out where the other working groups are, when we'll have something before us? Because it seems to me we got to go through the 30 to figure out what it is we want to take up or not. And I'm,
Senator.
The first thing I look at when I read a scientific paper, and we really are talking about a scientific thing here, is the credentials of the people who came up with the paper. I hate to be a stick in the mud.
You know.
If I picked up a scientific report and saw that, about a nuclear power plant, and saw that there was an airline executive, a selectman, somebody from the Old Colony Planning Council, making scientific specific recommendations, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to pick you. I wouldn't find it a credible piece of, I just wouldn't. I guess, I hate to do this, Sean, but I don't the reason I supported the interagency working group is because we're giving them both the mandate as state agencies who are supposed to be experts and have experts, and then give them resources to actually go a level deeper and bring in better people. And then what we're supposed to do is review the credibility of that based on the credentials of the people doing the work and assessing the efficacy of the work they're doing. I'm really concerned about the whole structure of these working groups as far as actually delivering recommendations that I'm going to be comfortable seeing as credible recommendations.
No, I
I mean,
mean-
viscerally I can vote on them, but intellectually I don't know if I can.
I think we all, and again, not to go beat the dead horse even better, is that was the effort with this first one.
Yep.
At a high level. That was the effort. That was not carried this evening. Maybe it'll be in time once people modify it or change it better. But I think the question on the table now is, do we want a second meeting to further discuss these topics? To hear more from the other, yes, Mike.
I want a second meeting. I mean, I am on the PSDAR working group and the site cleanup and restoration. We met before this meeting, planning another meeting before our next meeting to talk about these. And we did run into some of the same issues. We had a lot of, wordsmithing trying to happen, a lot of trying to sort out the process. I disagree a little bit with the senator, only because I don't think I'm trying to write a scientific paper, I think I'm trying to address a process. I'm trying to get to the point where I can offload my need for the science to an interagency working group, but say, how do we get there? And what do we need covered by that group and stuff? So I don't think, I don't want anybody to take what I'm doing as, the scientific paper. I want it to be taken as, the table of contents for what needs to be investigated, what slots need to be filled with expertise, whether that resides in the state or not, I don't really know yet.
Mr. Chairman,
I know we have a lot of great people here.
Because I completely agree. And so that the real important thing that we establish here is what is the relationship between this group and the interagency working group, such that we actually can write the table of contents, and we can have that kind of dialogue, and we can help task the group to come back with certain answers to questions, or do certain work that we ask them to do, humbly, not direct, but ask. That's what I'd like to see us, and that's a process question still.
Yep. But we first have got to get to the point that we're making a recommendation that there should be an interagency. We got to get there.
I want to meet again.
So, let's go back to that point. I have my calendar open, whatever, I will try to run down and chase it. The May 30th will be available.
I would say the first week of June, I mean, don't schedule it around me, right? I'm
Yeah,
one out
no.
of 21, but the first week of June is a lot better for me than the week of Memorial
How
Day.
about, we have June 6th, and then our regular meeting would be scheduled for June 20th. June 6th?
Don't we,
Is that a Wednesday?
oh, we're back to Wednesdays, is that what you're
Yeah,
suggesting?
trying to get back to
Oh,
Wednesdays.
okay, sorry.
But here's the problem. I'm gonna try to get this room. I have no guarantee, I mean, you can only imagine the logistics of putting this together. PACTV has been phenomenal, the schools have been phenomenal, but they book these rooms in advance. They do the best they can to accommodate us. So, if you want me to look at June 6th as a additional date, I will set upon doing it tomorrow. Is there a motion to look at June 6th as the second date? So moved. Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor, say aye. Aye. All opposed? Hearing none. Opposed, one opposed.
I do, too.
So the motion passes. I, co-chair, will take a look at, seeing if we can get June 6th as a second date. All right. As we're approaching it, and I think that, at least from what I'm hearing, Kurt, you may disagree, that a little bit more time to look at these materials, both from some of the state folks and from Entergy, would be helpful. So we'll postpone any further discussion unless somebody feels strongly about it on either the working groups ones that we have or on the draft findings that I submitted for discussion. Anybody feel strongly that we should not do that at the moment? Yes, John.
I agree with that. One recommendation I might make is that the next meeting be focused on your six draft recommendations. Because I think everybody agrees these are high-level, kind of overarching. And then by the next meeting, all the working groups have their subset of additional recommendations, at which time we could, Co-Chairman Schwartz's recommendation, prioritize them, and then use that next meeting to kind of get them down to the top 10, whatever.
Fine by me. Is there a consensus on that?
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Okay.
I have a question. So at the next meeting, are we going to vote, or is that what we've decided, or?
At the next meeting, we'll focus our discussion, the entire meeting,
Okay.
on these, the draft 6, unless somebody adds something else and everybody wants it. Okay? So with that, hearing nothing else, I'd like to give the public an opportunity to submit their ideas and comment on what they have this evening. How many members of the public would like to speak this evening? 1, 2, 3, 4. Four members of the public. We're going to allocate 20 minutes to it, so you get 5 minutes apiece. Let's start, Rich, we'll start with you.
Thank you. I'm going to make a recommendation. Before I do that, I want to say that it's based in part on my professional work experience, working over the years in power generation and waste management vendor firms, and what I'm about to say tends to reflect the corporate culture too. You may not believe it, but it does. And after I say this, I have a thought or suggestion in terms of how you're trying to accomplish expeditious review of recommendations. I'm calling this recommendation Entergy Proactiveness for Pilgrim Decommissioning. Finding: all cognizant parties to be involved with the Pilgrim decommissioning effort will need to adhere to applicable federal NRC regulations. Cognizant parties include the local host community, Plymouth, surrounding towns and municipalities in southeastern Massachusetts, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, Entergy, and even the NRC that needs to follow its own regulatory purview. The federal NRC regulations, while broad and encompassing, identify the minimum acceptable procedures, protocols, and requirements associated with nuclear power plant decommissioning. Recommendation: notwithstanding adherence to applicable federal NRC regulations, if better is possible, is commercially available, and is technically and economically feasible for Entergy to implement during the Pilgrim decommissioning effort, then it should be done to help enhance the overall safety and security during this multi-year, possibly multi-decade, decommissioning effort. In fact, this very concept was also identified and discussed in the top 5 Pilgrim Nuclear Power Station Issues Report regarding operating an older nuclear power plant in a post-Fukushima no-yucca mountain world that was submitted by the Town of Plymouth Nuclear Matters Committee to the Board of Selectmen back in April 2015. Any questions? Why don't we take a vote? Unofficial. Sorry to be a little flippant, but
Okay.
it's been a long day. Must have been the dinner I had. Sean, I was thinking that given open meeting law constraints that, and maybe you've already discussed this internally through your internal correspondence when you've disseminated draft working group questions, that if everybody has copies of working group findings and recommendations there, they should be submitting to you expeditiously only if they have any questions or objections or changing something of substance there. And if you can compile that, it's a little bit more work maybe for you, but if you can compile that for each of the 20 or 30 total working group recommendations, findings, recommendations, and get that out to everybody, then everybody ahead of time could see the issues. So when you come for a meeting there, at least you could focus on the hot buttons there, and then might be able to more effectively have a expeditious comment and voting time frame. Just a thought there, but rather than just everybody coming here and talking about it all at once. But I think if everybody could see what everybody's thinking, no comment on something means, I guess, everybody's happy with it, but doesn't mean it can't be discussed, but at least you could focus on maybe some of the more contentious working group recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you. Jim? You can be next.
Thanks, John. I'd like to start off by following up on both what Joe said and what he was just said about how to get things out to people so they can think about them in advance. Energy obviously has to, as all the state people do, and frankly, I would trust everybody else does, before they come and sit down here. That does raise, as Kurt and I have gone back and forth, an open meeting issue. But it's one in which an SJC decision of a couple of weeks ago may well have given you a way to accomplish it. The types of things that I'm hearing to circulate are recommendations and compilations of recommendations. Those, as in the Whalen case, clearly effectively include opinions. And that's where, as a pure fact and opinion, frankly, even selected facts reduce opinions. So how do you handle that, getting that stuff out so people can look at it and think about it? The SJC gave you a way to do it. What they told you to do was post it publicly contemporaneously with the time that you send it out, which is something that's basically, I don't think people have been doing that before, because I don't think, frankly, people ever thought that this particular loophole existed. The SJC, they created it, and hopefully they created it because it will make meetings much more efficient. If people can't see and think about others' ideas before meetings, it's an extraordinarily difficult process. So I strongly recommend that you follow the type of process that Joe and Richard recommended and comply with the open meeting law by making sure that you post all these recommendations and all of these compilations at essentially the same time they're sent out. Unless I misread it, and I've read the case 3 or 4 times, that should pass muster, and I think will also greatly increase the efficiency of your meetings. That's point 1. Point 2, and I never thought I would do it, but I'm going to hold up the NRC as an example of how to encourage this type of discussion and this type of knowledge. As you would expect, my wife's said a lot more than that, and we've all submitted stuff to the NRC. Substantive comments, often fairly long ones. The NRC acknowledges receipt. It very often gives you a substantive response by phone or often by email, and it posts what was sent to it on its website. That provides a great deal of information, not only of what has been sent to them, but also of where the NRC stands or is thinking, what is it thinking about? I would hope and expect that this panel and any interagency working group that might be established could at least meet the NRC standard.
Jim, let me just comment on that for a moment. You're looking at largely a volunteer group.
I know I am, and that's a problem.
And as we look at you guys, that the amount of money and time that individuals have already spent, from everything from minimal things like copying to the hours that have been spent writing and talking and listening. It is one of the fundamental flaws and challenges we've faced from the beginning, is that the legislation that had created the panel does not include any funding or any direction. One of the areas of real concern that I have from the discussions we've had tonight is we seem, for the moment at least, before people have a chance, to be heading in the same path of simply saying, well, we should be doing this, but there's no resources, there's no responsibility, there's no accountability, and there's no authority to do it. I appreciate your comments, but I can only say in the case of whether it's the individual groups that have already reported their working group findings or what I've done, those were distributed internally to each member as timely as they were available. I
But
think
they
you're
were
gonna-
not posted, which is what the SJC would have required.
And that's why there has been no deliberations, which is
The
why-
SJC basically said that effectively sending these out amounts to a deliberation. And although without saying so, they seem also to have appreciated, for God's sake, if I can't send them out, how are we going to run an effective meeting?
That's exactly right.
Which is why I am suggesting that if they were posted,
Do you want to talk
you could
about
actually make.
postings you'd like to do today?
No, but,
No, Jim and I have, we,
You-
Jim
you-
and I agree on this. We've been emailing.
Yeah.
This is we have not, so you know, no compilations have been sent out at all. I think going forward, under this new open meeting law case, there is a way for us to share more information than we could have up to several weeks ago.
great.
and do you need money?
So,
There's no question that you need money. But unfortunately, you have a public records law out there, you've got an open meeting law out there, and unless you comply with them, we're looking at all kinds of trouble down the road. Somehow, we have to, you, and frankly, us on the outside looking in, there has to be a process where the information that people need effectively to discuss things is made available before you come together once a month and sit down and see them for the first time, or nothing works. And anybody who's ever dealt with anybody group subject to the open meeting law knows that's a problem. We've been given a potential out, a potential way to accomplish it. And maybe one of the first things, anybody's got ideas, even people out in the public, let's sit down and figure out how we can make this work better. What do you need to do it? Because what's been happening so far is clearly not working.
Not working as well as it could.
Clearly. My second comment would basically, if I could slice on this working group recommendations, I don't think that is a particularly good idea. I think the working group compositions are very mixed. What recommendations they might come up with, in many cases, will be ideas or recommendations that I doubt anything approaching the full panel would approve. And I think to put those recommendations into a report would be a serious mistake. If someone wanted to write a report that in effect took those recommendations and turned them into issues that the panel has to consider and simply presented them that way, that might be fine. But the minute something goes into a report as a recommendation, people are rapidly going to forget that it was made by a 4-person working group who knows who the members were, who knows what expertise they had. If it's recommendation, they should be recommendations of the panel in a report, not just the working groups.
Thank you, Joe. Mike?
So good evening. My name is Mike Fortini. I'm a longtime, in fact, lifelong resident of Plymouth. And based on my background, I was asked to provide comments on the 2 NRC documents associated with the PDSAR, which I have done. And the reason I'm here tonight is to present the comments that I've prepared for those 2 documents. However, I've only made 12 hard copies, not knowing how many people would attend. So, Mr. Chairman, I guess I would need direction as to how I should officially transmit these to the panel.
Well, you certainly could give us hard copies, the ones you have, and then I'd ask that you send a copy to Kurt and myself. I gave you my information.
I have your card. I would
Yeah, if you
appreciate
just send it
getting
to me,
Kurt's
I'll make sure Kurt will
contact
distribute it.
information, and I can certainly forward this in expeditious fashion to you.
That'll be perfect.
Mr. Chairman, I think it would be helpful if Mike gave a little of his background, because it's very, very relevant to the discussion that's been going on tonight.
Excellent.
So, I'm retired presently, so I am an engineer by degree. In fact, actually a registered professional engineer. I'm also licensed by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts as a power plant operator. But my background, similar in some respects with Rich, is for 25 years I worked for an EPC, Stone & Webster, designing and constructing nuclear power plants. Subsequent to that, for approximately 18 years before I retired, I worked for a multinational company that we provided controls to both existing nuclear plants globally and also to grassroots plants in China, both in the safety environment as well as the non-safety environment. And before I retired, I was the director of all global nuclear operations for the company. So that's kind of my background.
Great resource. Thank you. Any other questions, comments?
What PSDAR reports is he reporting on?
I don't know, I haven't seen
The
them.
two NRC documents, which
Oh, the long
Yeah,
ones,
last-
the 349.
Oh,
389
the November
page.
and the
November and the
January one?
yeah,
Okay,
November 20th and January of
The regulatory
2018.
basis
Yeah.
document and the analysis document of the regulatory basis document.
The small one.
And in the smaller one, the 188-page one versus the 349-page one. And along those same lines, then it's not been brought up in any of our discussions, but once we get through what we're doing, whatever we wind up doing for late June, the next big milestone that at least I see is probably going to come at the end of this calendar year, because that's when the NRC has said, in conversations I've had with them in Washington, that they are proposing to come out with their actual notice of proposed rulemaking that is the next step from the November regulatory basis document and then the January analysis document of the basis document. But that proposed rulemaking document will come out. There'll be a hearing on it, and we will have the opportunity to comment on it. It's likely to be a very comprehensive document because I've read all 537 pages of those two documents a couple of times. I'm just used to doing that. But there's, that's why I have glasses and gray hair and so forth. But I think it's something, although it's down the line, it's something we need to keep in the back of our heads, because that's a huge issue. And the kinds of things they're gonna come out with that time, this panel, in my view, has got to review that document, discuss it, and then come up with whatever it wants to do. Does it want to make a series of comments directly to the NRC, or to do it to the governor and the general court and the legislature and ask them or suggest them to submit those kinds of comments? That's coming at the end of the year, and it's going to be a huge undertaking. And to the extent we can use people like Mike and Rich and so forth and so on, who have direct experience in that field to help us, in addition to the folks, our colleagues from Entergy, we need to keep that in mind, because that's coming at the end of the year.
Thank you, Joe. And thank you.
Thank you.
Please send me a copy. Would anybody like a hard copy now?
I don't believe you.
No, why don't you just raise your hands, whoever would like a hard copy now. Pass it
If I
around.
could get,
Just pass around.
Yeah, I can get a card.
Thanks, Mike. Thank you, Michael. Mary?
Yes, Joe, I've read them 2 or 3 times too, but funny, I don't have gray hair.
Well, you have more than I do.
This is a preview of a recommendation I'm going to send probably this week. This is the issue. The issue is, it is very important that the state understands or has a voice in what the licensee is going to use as the date that they are assuming the spent fuel will leave the site, because that will affect the decisions on cost analysis, whether they assume it's leaving in 2040 or whether they go along, let's say, with what the NRC had suggested, that it might be on site for 60 years, for 100 years, for 300 years. And so it's important what that date is. It not only affects a cost analysis, but it also affects decisions, to speak to Pine's concern, of how long sea level rise will happen and whether it will impact the location of the spent fuel pool, rather the dry gas pad. So my recommendation, in a sense, will say Pilgrim's licensees, decommissioning plans, and cost estimates should not assume the projections may put forth by DOE's projections for off-site storage as described in DOE's strategy for the management and disposal of used nuclear fuel and high-level radioactive waste, published January 2013. This is not a scientific thing, Senator. This is something you could actually read, okay? And why is this important? The DOE document says that they will begin operations of a pilot interim storage facility by 2021. Second, licensing of a large interim storage facility will be available by 2025. They will make progress on a geologic repository by 2048. In Vermont, this is something that Entergy and Northstar were relying upon. But they didn't read what DOE said. Full implementation of this program will require legislation to enable the timely deployment of the system elements noted above. So, should you be satisfied that when Entergy comes up with its cost analyses or responds to the location of the second pad, that they quote or rely, as Entergy's preliminary decommissioning cost analysis did on 2042, when it's all going to be out of here, Northstar, in its April 6, 2017, revised Vermont Yankee post-shutdown decommissioning activities report, quoted directly the DOE 2013 document. Entergy's December 2014 post-shutdown decommissioning activities report said it's all going to be completed by 2052. So, would you rely or would you recommend that instead of the licensee relying on the overly optimistic, that they rely instead for not the worst case scenario, but a more realistic one, so the money would be there and the proper planning would take place? That, I think, is very important. I mean, I look at saying a permanent geologic repository in 2048. The state of Nevada has almost 300 pieces of litigation to go through. There are groups, I'm not among them, but are educating communities about the dangers of transportation routes. Holtec is hoping to build an interim site, starting to be looked at in New Mexico, and WCI is hoping to, WSI, have a site in Texas. But like when? what about the legislation? Have you seen Congress really do anything? What about the necessary funding for NRC to be able to do its work in analyzing these sites? So just keep that in mind when you read the cost estimates, et cetera. So I will send the findings and the recommendation.
Are there any other comments for this evening, or I'll entertain a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second? Second. All in favor?
Aye.
The next evening, we'll see you.
Was it Sean, May 16th, it's a Wednesday.
Yeah, we know we're back on the Wednesday.
Do you have this in electronic? Because I just want to post this to tonight's meeting. This came to you from Joe, from Pine? Okay. Pine? Can you email this to me so I can post it for tonight's?
Joe has
Or
to
this-
email it, because I sent him track changes, and
Okay.
he